It's been like 3 days of a lot of data and information and stuff. So today, this time around, I thought I would try something different. I've never done a talk quite like this before, so this is a new experience for me. But I wanted to just share some of my own personal experiences and some stories that have really formed my understanding of what suffering is, of how to work with pain. And those experiences really gave birth to the career that I found myself in for the last 10 years, and that is of a spiritual care practitioner working in healthcare. And yeah, so like you had a little snippet of in my little autobiographical statement, I started out as a research scientist and interestingly studying biochemistry of mammalian viruses and how they interact with our immune systems. And I had that desire to do something that would somehow address pain and suffering, I guess, was part of the motivation. Plus I love science. And so that kind of took me down that road. But I was sitting in the laboratory late one night, as I often did. If you've ever worked in research, it involves a lot of late nights sitting in the lab. And it just suddenly struck me that even if I could cure every disease in the world, suffering would continue to go on and on and on, because suffering, it doesn't really arise from our physical bodies. Suffering arises from our hearts, from our minds, from the way we think, and from our internal experiences and processes. So I am trying to change my slide here. Come on, there we go. So I guess we're supposed to tell you that about our disclosures. I have nothing to disclose. So that desire to understand suffering and human suffering, and okay, if we can't treat human suffering by treating viral diseases, which is where I was at the time, then where do we go and what do we do? And so I started exploring various different spiritual paths, philosophical paths, a little bit of psychology, and I landed in a Buddhist understanding of suffering, which for me made the most sense out of anything that I had come across. And the Buddhist understanding of suffering says that suffering arises from wanting something other than that which is present. It's very simple, right? I don't want something that I've got. I don't like the situation I'm in. I want a different situation. I want something I don't have, or I don't want something that I do have. And so we suffer because we're in this state of dissatisfaction. And sometimes that state of dissatisfaction is very deep and profound. We know that some degree of suffering is an unavoidable part of the human experience, is that we cannot live a human life without having some kind of suffering in our lives. And we also know that some degree of pain is also an unavoidable part of the human experience. We live in these bodies. These bodies are subject to injury. They're subject to illness. They're subject to all manner of discomfort. And so we know that we cannot avoid pain and suffering. But as we've heard a number of the different speakers allude to, pain and suffering are not necessarily the same thing. And so a useful way for us to understand this is that, and we heard actually Dr. 𝐒𝐂𝐂 talked about this quite a bit as well, that there is quite a big difference between pain and suffering, and that pain is a physical, emotional, or spiritual discomfort that arises in our lives. We know that, we've all experienced it. But it's the resistance to pain that gives rise to suffering. So we could put it in a simple formula: pain times resistance equals suffering. And I've seen that formula in a number of different books. And Chris Germer, who's one of the researchers in self-compassion, has written about that in his book, The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion. So if you wanted to read more about that, he kind of goes into this point. And that resistance is the effort that is made to make pain go away, including ruminating on how to make pain go away, right? So it's like that: I don't like the pain, I hate the pain, I want to make the pain go away. How am I going to make this pain go away? All of that effort and energy that goes into trying to force pain to go away gives rise to an increase in suffering. So suffering is the physical and emotional tension that we add to our pain layer upon layer. So if we have pain, which in and of itself is an unpleasant experience, right? Obviously, most of us don't like pain. If we like pain, then we're a little concerned, right? And then on top of that, we put this anxiety around it that I don't like this pain. When we're in the presence of something we don't like, we tend to feel more tension, right? So there's this emotional tension that builds, and then I don't like that emotional tension in and of itself is a source of discomfort. So now we have more discomfort and more tension. And then we hate it. We want it to go away. It's not going away. Why isn't it going away? I'm afraid it'll never go away. And we have layer upon layer upon layer of this emotional tension. And so clearly how we relate to pain influences how much we suffer. So pain in and of itself could be considered to be a source of suffering, but it's these emotional, these layers and layers and layers of emotional tension and thinking and rumination and stuff that really gives rise to how much we're going to suffer in response to that pain. So we know, and we've heard a number of speakers also mention this point too, the more we resist pain, the more we focus on it, right? When we're in the presence of something that we don't like and that we wish would go away, we tend to focus on it. The more we hate pain, the more we focus on it. So, you know, if you're in the presence of something you hate, the more you're going to focus on it. If you've ever been in the room with a mosquito, you know what it's like, right? You don't like the mosquito, you're afraid that the mosquito is going to bite you, you don't know exactly where it is, you hear it buzzing around, you're trying to pay attention to something that you're doing, but you can't because all you focus on is where's that darn mosquito, right? It sucks our attention right to it. And then we know that focusing on pain, and I think Dr. Neff mentioned this just now, that focusing on pain intensifies the experience of pain. And so, and then another important point to recognize is that the further expectation is from reality, the greater the suffering. So if I have an expectation of being, for example, pain-free, and my reality is that I have a lot of pain, the distance between those things is going to determine how much suffering I have as well. And so this really came home to me. So, you know, my interest in suffering took me down the road into an interest in Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist meditation, which took me to Asia, which took me to practicing Zen meditation in Korea. And so I was very, very excited to go to my first 90-day intensive Zen meditation retreat. And so that involved, it was only 12 hours a day, which if you're familiar with intensive Zen retreats, isn't really that much. But for somebody who's never been in that situation before, it's a lot. So 12 hours a day of sitting meditation. And I was so excited because I thought, oh, this is going to be just so great. So my expectation was, wow, this is going to be like a really, really beautiful, blissful experience. So I had this expectation that I was going to experience bliss. And what I didn't realize is I had never spent that much time. I spent time in meditation, obviously, prior to doing that. And what I thought was a significant amount of time, but I had never spent 12 hours a day, day after day after day in sitting meditation. And so the reality was, it was really, really painful. And if you've ever tried to sit still, you know, even just sitting in your chair, like usually we're moving around, but when you're sitting in a Zen hall, you're sitting in a room with maybe 30 other people, and everybody's sitting quietly on their cushions, and everybody's keeping silence, and there's no talking, and so you're sitting very still. And my back was cramping up, and my hips hurt, and my knees hurt, and I was having so much pain. And the more I tried to get comfortable, the worse it got. And so this resistance was like, I got to get comfortable. So I like try a little bit of a higher cushion, a little bit of a lower cushion. Maybe if I put a little support under my knee, it'll get better. Maybe if I put a little support under my hands, it'll get better. Maybe if I do this, if I do that. And the more I tried to get comfortable, the worse it got. And so it was more pain, and then just really falling into this despair. And then we would sit for 50 minutes, then we'd get up and walk for 10 minutes. And during during the walking period, you could leave if you had to leave. And I fled the Zen hall, and the only quiet place I could find to go was a storage closet. So I went in the storage closet and I sat down and cried because it was like, and in the internal dialogue was just all around how much I hated the pain. I can't stand the pain. And then it went, and then I just started going into, I'm a total failure. I really wanted to do this. I'm not going to be able to do this. I can't do this. I'm terrible at this. Everybody else can do this, but I can't. And this whole ruminating thought process. And then at some point I just stopped and just went into a kind of surrender. And I just came to the conclusion that, well, I can't be comfortable. It's not possible to be comfortable. And so the only response was for me to really tell myself in a kind of more compassionate way that, well, pain does not equal failure. And I'm not going to be able to be comfortable. So let's have a new expectation. Let's see if I can just sit with pain and not focus on it. And so the internal dialogue changed, right? Instead of, I hate the pain, I wish the pain would go away, it started to become, well, it's interesting how pain changes when I don't focus on it. Well, pain is part of the experience of being human, and I can do this anyway. And so there was a real internal shift in terms of what happened. And interestingly, as I began then to sit with the pain, not to focus on trying to make the pain go away. As soon as I stopped trying to make the pain go away, the pain got better because my body relaxed. And so the cramp that was in my back started to relax, and everything started to relax. My legs relaxed, my hips relaxed, and I was actually able to sit with less pain because I had given up on trying to get rid of the pain. So that was a very interesting learning for me. You know, we talk about in these kinds of meditation practices, the point is to actually just be able to sit with the experience that you're having and to let go of wanting it to be different, right? That Buddhist definition of suffering, wanting something other than that which is present, which is exactly where I landed, and then had to actually say, well, can I actually put that philosophy into actual practice? So what I learned from that really was that how I was relating to my own pain had a significant impact on how I related to myself. So I hate the pain very quickly morphed into I'm a total failure. And what I had to come to understand was that pain isn't wrong. Pain is part of the experience of being human. And then that hatred makes everything worse. So being in that state of mind where I just hate everything just created so much tension around the entire experience that everything felt worse. And so when we talk about pain, pain can't be right or wrong. It's an experience of pain. And I think we do a disservice when we talk about patients coming in and complaining of pain, because a complaint is to describe something that is wrong or that isn't going well or that isn't right or that, right? People come in and they describe an experience of pain. And I think like using a different language around pain would help. You know, Dr. Martin this morning mentioned that sometimes people come in complaining of pain and they're sort of perceived to be whiners. And I think if we weren't complaining, but we were describing an experience, maybe that would help to shift that perception a little bit. So that's just thought that I had when he was talking this morning. So if I take that experience that I had and try to fit it into Kristin Neff's self-compassion model, you could see that the awareness of the pain, so I have pain, was aware that I hate the pain, I'm afraid of the pain. The more I struggle, the more I hate everything, including myself. And so this mindfulness really helped me to see what is the state that I'm in. And then common humanity is like, well, pain is an unavoidable part of the human experience. Pain isn't wrong. And I can't possibly be alone in this. I'm sure other people sitting around that room were feeling that too, although we weren't talking to each other at that point. And so the application of self-kindness is really what helps to lessen that state of pain. So surrender, which I use the word surrender, is to accept being human as a state of imperfection. And surrender allows acceptance, and acceptance allows interest. So once I had accepted that, okay, fine, I'm going to have pain, I can't get rid of it, then I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's interesting how where my mind goes determines in part what I'm experiencing. And that interest then allowed love and kindness. So then I could approach the experience with love and kindness instead of self-hatred. So time went on, a few years went by. I did some 4 years of formal study, and then I started doing some more sitting retreats. And so the fifth time that I was undergoing one of these intensive retreats, I had a lot more experience now, a lot more understanding of pain and suffering. We were sitting for about 15 hours a day in a Zen meditation hall for Buddhist nuns. And my expectation had shifted now. I wasn't expecting bliss anymore. I'd kind of grown past that, and I was expecting this, oh, this is going to be interesting. And then my reality changed yet again. And right in the middle of this 90-day sitting period, I experienced extremely intense pain and joint inflammation all over my body. What I didn't know at the time was that I had the onset of moderate to severe rheumatoid arthritis, but I didn't know what it was at that point. And then the resistance thinking started to come in. It was like, this shouldn't be happening. This is wrong. And the internal dialogue was all about, like, what's going on? Something's wrong. Am I dying? I don't want to die. There was fear. There was this kind of real emotional discomfort around it. And again, had to take myself to a place of surrender. It's like, okay, this is happening. This is the reality. This is the current reality of what's happening, right? I don't know what's going on. And so my practice then shifted toward practicing loving kindness toward myself, and changed the expectation to watching the mind states come and go. And so the internal dialogue also shifted then. Am I in a state of loving kindness? Is this is the experience I'm having? I can't change it. So what kind of mind do I want to approach this with? I want to approach this with a mind of loving kindness. It's interesting how I'm cycling through fear, aversion, and acceptance, right? If I'm dying, what kind of state do I want to be in, right? If I'm dying, I want to be in a state of loving kindness. I don't want to die in a state of fear. And those are the kinds of thoughts that I had. And so I just spent the rest of the time sitting and watching the mind come and go. And then took myself back to Canada to figure out what was going on. And lo and behold, I have rheumatoid arthritis. So having compassion when we are in pain, having compassion for ourselves, it's really important. And as we heard Dr. Neff talk about, it's really important in terms of how we respond to other people when we want to have compassion for other people. So compassion really means to suffer together. And so it's the feeling that arises when you're confronted with another sufferer and suffering and feel motivated to relieve the suffering. And human connection and that willingness to touch the suffering of another requires a careful attention to one's own inner experience, one's own suffering, and one's own emotional and spiritual response to those sufferings. And so when I came back to Canada with rheumatoid arthritis and I was learning how to live with it, I recognized really that having that opportunity to experience pain when I was in a place where I had no choice. Well, I guess I could have run away, but I didn't, but no choice other than to sit in a kind of introspective, contemplative way with it, allowed me to really see how much working with it on that level with myself really helped me to cope with the experience. And knowing that, I thought, I want to be able to then connect with other people who are in pain. And that sort of launched me into the whole career of becoming a spiritual care practitioner. Dr. Rachel Raymond writes, compassion begins with the acceptance of what is most human in ourselves, what is most capable of suffering. In attending to our own capacity to suffer, we can uncover a simple and profound connection between our own vulnerability and the vulnerability in all others. Experiencing this allows us to find an instinctive kindness toward life, which is the foundation of all compassion and genuine service. And I really love the way she says that. So when I allow my own pain and suffering and allow myself to respond to my own pain and suffering, instead of trying to run away from it or turn away from it, just to see and to really know this is that common humanity piece that Krista Neff talks about, that suffering is a pain is part of life. Suffering is part of life. There's nothing I can do about it other than experience it and then see what I can do to address it through being kind and compassionate. And then that's how we actually can share it with others. But in order to make that compassionate connection with others, we have to be able to actually feel the suffering ourselves. So Frank Ostaseski, who's done a lot of work in contemplative end-of-life care, says, if we're not willing to explore our own suffering, then we'll only be guessing as we try to understand our patients. It's the exploration of our own suffering that allows us to serve others. This is what allows us to touch another person's pain with compassion instead of fear and pity. And we have to be willing to listen, not only to the patient, but to ourselves. And so it's like my suffering and your suffering, the causes for them might be different, but the actual experience of suffering isn't that different. And so if I can touch my own suffering, I can actually make a really good and deep, authentic connection with people with whom I work. And so, you know, there's lots and lots and lots of clinical stories that I could tell, but I just picked out a couple of them, and we can maybe touch on some more later in the discussion if we want. But so I worked with this elderly man, Gino. He was a 92-year-old Italian immigrant. He was in pain with fractures. He'd lost his ability to manage most of his ADLs. And he was like, don't get old, getting old is terrible. And then he would say, my God, why is this happening to me? And then I came in as the spiritual care provider, and he looked at me as if to challenge me for a solution to his anguish, like, tell me why God is doing this to me. And knowing I didn't have a solution or an answer to it, I just said to him, because you're human. And it just, this simple truth that his suffering was part of the reality of being in the last years of his natural life, he was able to understand his suffering in a different way. Like, yeah, I guess I can't expect my body to not break down. I guess I can't expect to not be facing the end of my life when I'm 92. And so that opened the ability for us to talk about his life journey with all of its ups and downs, and what his spirituality and beliefs were around living and dying, and help him to construct some different meaning, not just this is all suffering, it's all bad, but actually look through his life and put this experience into the context of his life and create something meaningful that he could take with him into those final days. So Pema Chodron is the American Buddhist writer and teacher, says things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem, but the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart. Then they come together again and fall apart again. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen, room for grief, for relief, for misery, for joy. So it's like we can't solve the problem of suffering. We can't completely remove the problem of pain. And so if we only uphold the so-called positive things and try to avoid the negative things, then we get into trouble. And so it's like, I think part of the problem that we have in medicine today and in pain and is this idea that pain is wrong, that pain is somehow wrong, that we should be able to live in a completely pain-free state, right? And you see it in advertising. I don't know if I hear this commercial on the TV sometimes, pain says you can't. This drug says you can, and all you have to do is take this drug, and then you'll be running around and throwing your grandchildren into the air and being happy. And it's selling this idea that somehow all we need is a pill or something and pain will go away, and then we can go back to living the way we should be living, which is in a completely pain-free state, which isn't really very realistic. I know we've spent like the last 3 days talking about how unrealistic it is to expect to be able to live in a world where there is no pain. So the question isn't how do we live it, how do we create a world where there is no pain, but how do we create a world where we can integrate the experience of pain and not lose a sense of meaning in our lives because of it? So another patient that I worked with, we'll call her Michelle, was a young woman who was undergoing testing for headaches and seizures. And the investigation stretched out over days and weeks, and she wasn't sleeping well. She was from a rural area. Her husband had to go home to attend to the farm, so she was by herself in the hospital. Very common story these days with COVID too, is a lot of people by themselves in the hospital, right? Everybody kept telling her how brave and strong she was, and her nurse came in and said, "You're doing great," which just resulted in her falling into an existential crisis and a state of despair. And over several days, I spent some time sitting with her in her pain and her suffering and just witnessing it and being there with her, developing sort of a compassionate connection with her. And then one day I suggested sometimes all you can do is surrender. And I don't mean give up, but in a spiritual sense, to just allow yourself to be in the experience without fighting, without having to do great, right? Because whenever people said to her, "You're doing so great," she would think, I'm not doing great, this is horrible. And she felt like a failure. So I was like, what if you didn't have to feel great? What if you could just allow yourself to feel awful? And she had the experience during the night where she saw herself as she was, exhausted and in pain, but also loved in her family and in her life. And her despair slowly started to be replaced by gratitude, and a way forward for her started to open. And that all came from this expectation that you don't have to do great all the time. You don't have to be free of suffering. Sometimes it's helpful just to acknowledge that, to surrender to it, just to say, this is the experience I'm having. I don't necessarily have to change it. And so I thought, as the only spiritual care practitioner, I think, participating here, when we talk about interdisciplinary care, we don't talk about spiritual care all that much. And that's one of the things I'm hoping that we can change over time. But really what we need to do as part of our care, as part of our holistic addressing of care, is to address spiritual distress. And in Alberta Health Services, we describe spiritual distress as the loss or disruption of meaning and connection in relation to ourselves, to others, and to capital O other, which is what one considers ultimate or transcendent. And that might be nature, it might be the universe, it might be a higher power, it might be God, it might be whatever that person considers to be ultimate or transcendent. So pain, illness, trauma, loss, et cetera, all can disrupt our identity, how we see ourselves, what we expect of ourselves. They disrupt our connections with others and the frameworks through which we understand and create meaning in our life experiences. And so attending to the spiritual dimensions of experience can profoundly influence how one relates to pain and illness, and thereby provide opportunities for healing. And this is true both for their patients that we work with, but also for ourselves as healthcare providers, because we can't separate our humanity from who we are as healthcare providers, and we shouldn't. So I wanted to put that little plug in for that. And so I just want to conclude, because I know we're coming to the end here. Just some thoughts that I wanted to put out there that we can maybe pick up during our discussion, and say that it is a basic human need to feel understood and acknowledged in our experience, regardless of whether that experience is painful or joyful. So I say avoid this toxic positivity that when I sit on my meditation cushion, I have to experience bliss, otherwise I'm a failure. Or that my patient has to be strong and good and doing great, right? Maybe she can be just awful, and maybe that's okay. Because when we compare ourselves to unrealistic, positive ideals, we end up putting ourselves in a place where we feel like we've failed. And that's not helpful for healing. For healing to occur, we need to make room for and allow the full range of human feeling and experience, which includes joy and relief and being pain-free in the moments where we're able to be pain-free, but it also includes grief and loss and despair and pain and suffering. And that is all part of the full range of our human experience. We can't cut off only part of our experience. So approaching pain and suffering as a natural part of the human experience, yours and mine, facilitates compassion and can help really to ease suffering. And so we need self-awareness and we need self-compassion. And Dr. Neff explained that to us brilliantly. I love her work just moments ago, that self-compassion and self-awareness for our own suffering are really critical prerequisites for true presence and authentic, compassionate connection with others who are suffering, right? Because my pain and your pain are not different. If I'm afraid of my own pain, I'm also going to be afraid of your pain. If I'm not afraid of my own pain, then if I can sit with my own pain, then I'm much better positioned to sit with your pain. And then we can actually really make an authentic connection, and we can start to find ways to do that. I think I'll just end by saying that, when you ask people who are undergoing therapy, the single most important thing is the connection they feel with the therapist, not necessarily the type of therapy they're receiving. And so this ability to actually be with suffering in compassion with ourselves and be in suffering in compassion with another person is really what sort of opens up a therapeutic connection that can then really be really deep and effective. So I'm going to stop there. And one more time, thank you so much for inviting me to come and share with you. And yeah, we'll see you again in the discussion time.